Chris Mackowski for Emerging Civil War. I am in Knoxville, Tennessee with my friend Jim Doncaster of the Knoxville Civil War Roundtable, and Jim is showing me the sites of the Battle of Knoxville, which took place at the end of November 1863. And I'm used to the guys talking about the guys fighting at Mine Run at this very same time, but here we've got guys from the Eastern Theater that are out in the West, and we're the location of one of the key spots on the battlefield, Fort Sanders. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Named after the fallen William Sanders, who died on the 18th of November. Fort Sanders was kind of the key to the whole line, and both sides realized it. Orlando Poe, the engineering officer, knowing that it was a weak point because it was the salient, did a couple of things to make it even more formidable than otherwise might have been.
And we're on the top of a very high piece of ground right here.
We are indeed. We unfortunately can't see that right now from where we're standing, Chris. We're standing next to the monument to the fallen Confederate soldiers erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. But you can't see from where we're standing how high we are and how the ridge falls away in both directions.
So it's a pretty commanding piece of ground, but it's also vulnerable because, as you say, it sticks out as a salient from the rest of the Union line.
It does. The main Union lines north of the river run east-west, and they bend to our left as we stand here, Chris, and run a good mile or so to the east of us. They also they bend 90 degrees and run south to the river from this point. So, as I said, both sides realized this was a very vulnerable point. Longstreet realized it because he could rush a lot of men at this corner and only draw limited fire because it was a salient. And if he did it quickly enough, he could actually mass his men about 600 yards from here, down over the hill behind us, down by the railroad tracks. And those men could rush upon this lines, and the Union defenders could only get off a shot or two before they were set upon.
Now, and this reminded me, when Jim was telling me about this a few minutes ago, about the Muleshoe salient at Spotsylvania and Grant's decision to attack the tip of the Muleshoe, because there the defenders have diverging fire, whereas Grant's attacking forces would have converging fire. And the same sort of situation happens here, whereas Longstreet rushes the tip of this salient, the defenders really are having diverging fire and can't concentrate against these Confederate attackers. What poses such a challenge for Longstreet, though, as he gets up here?
Well, Poe, being a good engineering officer that he was, realized the weakness of the position. Despite its height, it was a salient, and he decided to make it a little more difficult. The deepest ditches along this line were right here at Fort Sanders, whereas they were mostly 10 or 12 feet deep around a lot of the line. Here they tended to be 15 to 20 feet deep. And he also carved off, a lot of times when pits are dug and parapets raised, a berm remains in between the two. And Poe, in this case, shaved that off. So you had a very steep, precipitous climb from top of the parapet to reach the top of the parapet from the bottom of the ditch. Of course, Longstreet wasn't allowed to come in and examine the lines.
Sure,
and
sure.
Watching from a distance with binoculars, he and his officers watched men moving freely in and out, and they could see the upper bodies of these soldiers exposed. Ledbetter, the Confederate engineering officer who had engineered the original fortifications, limited as they were around Knoxville, reinforced this notion that the ditches were not deep at all. And so Longstreet had this mistaken notion that if they attacked that salient, that they could quickly scale the parapet. What he didn't know was that the men he was observing moving freely in and out were walking on planks over that deep ditch. So on the 29th, the early morning of the 29th, his men got considerable surprise. The other thing is surprise.
And we're in Knoxville. The fort is gone. The city is here. We're fighting the traffic.
The other surprise that Poe had for the Confederate forces attacking Fort Sanders was a series of entanglements around the ground leading up to that salient we've spoken of.
And this just amazed me when Jim was telling me about this. I just thought this was brilliant.
Yeah, somebody had come to Burnside and to Poe early on when the Union Army occupied Knoxville in September and told Poe about a warehouse full of telegraph wire and could he use it. And Poe, being enterprising, said he thought he could put it to use, and that is exactly what he did. He, of course, like at any Civil War fort, he had cleared the ground for a field of fire before the fort, but he had left the stumps, and the stumps rose up 2, 3, 4 feet in some cases in front of the fort. And what he did is took this telegraph wire and strung it between these stumps in a maze of wire.
So sort of like the forerunner of later barbed wire that you see in World War I, right?
Exactly. And the Confederates, again, who were observing at a distance, did not see. They saw the stumps, but they didn't realize that the wire was run between those stumps and that it was quite an entanglement to be negotiated. And when they attacked, and it was still pretty dark, it was just pre-dawn light, they got into that thing, and command and control structures started breaking down pretty early.
And then there's one last complication that you mentioned, that was the weather, and what did it do to the ground as these guys are trying to get up this steep parapet?
Yeah, it was late November. There had been rain, there had been frost, and the forts around here were, of course, comprised of the red clay soil that predominates in this area. So you had red clay and a steep slope that had gotten wet and gotten extremely slippery. So it was a great challenge to the Confederates who got into this deep ditch to get back out again. Because they had thought that the ditch was not as deep as it was, and because they thought that it was not as slippery as it was, they did not send any scaling equipment. These guys went in with what their muskets and their hand weapons, and they got into the ditch and couldn't get out.
And so they just started piling up on top of each other.
They did. The first ones that got to the ditch after getting through the entanglements looked at it, and they couldn't go back. They were ranks of men behind them coming forward, so they jumped into the ditch, and the ranks behind them did exactly the same, and they tried to struggle to climb that parapet.
This to me seems like one of those little bits of dark Civil War irony, because it sounds like the Battle of the Crater in some ways, where Burnside was in command and his men get into the crater, can't get out, pile up on top of each other. Here, Burnside has that happen in front of his lines with James Longstreet's men.
Exactly. There were some Herculean efforts made on the part of the Confederates. There were some that tried to hack hand and foot holes into the side of the ditch to climb that parapet. There were others who stood on one another's shoulders to get men up to the top of the parapet. Every man that made it to the top was either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, pulled into the fort.
Some pretty lopsided casualties as a result of this battle.
Absolutely. One of the most lopsided. I think it corresponds in some ways to Jackson's fight at New Orleans. There were only 13 casualties inside.
And there we're talking Andrew Jackson, for those folks who are maybe mistaking Stonewall Jackson here, Battle of War of 1812.
Exactly. Very one-sided action.
Yes.
This was a very one-sided action with 13 casualties, 8 men wounded, 5 killed outright on the Union side. Three Medal of Honors awarded to those for the captures of Confederate flags that were placed on the tops of the parapet. A lot of there weren't any awards bestowed to the Confederates, but there should have been, because the men that made it up there sacrificed their life for their cause.
And how many Confederate casualties were there?
Well, it's pretty amazing. 813 casualties on the Confederate side. 129 men killed in the ditch. Another 458 wounded, and the remainder captured. Yeah,
man, that is
813 casualties on the Confederate side, 13 on the Union side. I know of no other action in the Civil War with such lopsided figures.
That sounds almost as lopsided as Burnside at Fredericksburg, but in reverse. Chris Mackowski from Diverging Civil War. I'm out here exploring Knoxville with my friend Jim Doncaster from the Knoxville Civil War Roundtable. We've got more coming up as we continue to explore the city. I'm going to give us one quick look here with the stick. Hard to see, but we're kind of on the top of the hill, pretty steep down that way, and we're right at the crest of the hill over here. So good commanding topographical position, but had lots of inherent weaknesses to it too. We're going to continue to explore. Thanks for being with us here in Knoxville,
Chris?
Tennessee. Oh wait, Jim, yeah?
If we take a few steps, we can look down at what the Confederates were looking at.
Oh yeah, sure. Since Jim's going to give us the opportunity here, I'm going to walk and talk as we move. And just when you thought you were going to be able to get off the hook and sign off here for a second. But so Jim, let me tell you here, the city has really built up and swallowed the battlefield. That's got to be a little frustrating for a battlefield fan like you.
Yeah, it is frustrating. We do have a fortification extant that we'll visit here in a bit, Chris. But where the site of the action occurred is it's unfortunately fallen to urban and suburban development here.
So we can take a look here and see what the Confederates were coming up from this direction. There's a railroad that's down at the bottom of that hill. And Jim, that railroad was strategically important. It made Knoxville an important place. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it was Knoxville is the juncture of 2 railroads, actually. It's all the same, really. The East Tennessee and Virginia runs to the east and north of us, connecting Knoxville to Richmond, and to the south of us, to the west and south, is the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad, connecting Knoxville and Virginia to the deep south. So this was a very strategically important area. And
probably good to remind folks that East Tennessee was very Unionist. So we've got this rail line that's vitally important to the Confederacy in the heart of Unionist territory, so that poses some problems for both sides as well.
Yep. The other thing that occurred here, once Kirby Smith was called by Bragg to join him before the Battle of Chickamauga and before the investment of Chattanooga, the Confederates did occupy this. And once Kirby Smith left and Burnside moved in from Kentucky, that forced James Longstreet to make the long circuitous route through the Carolinas down into Georgia and up to arrive on the night of the first day before the second day breakthrough at Chickamauga. So he wouldn't have had to, he would have been there much earlier had Knoxville remained in Confederate hands, and he was able to take the route that he was originally designed to take.
So Chris Mackowski, Jim Doncaster from the Knoxville, Tennessee Civil War Roundtable. We're exploring Knoxville. We've got more coming up. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back.